George Washington by Laura K. Murray. Who was George Washington? George Washington is called the father of his country. He led the army that won the Revolutionary War, 1775 to 1783. This war helped the United States become its own country. Then he became the first president of the United States. George was a brave and truthful leader. He believed the country was strongest when people worked together. He helped make the United States of America what it is today. Growing up George. George was born nearly 300 years ago on February 22nd, 1732. His family lived on a large farm in Virginia. Virginia was one of 13 colonies in North America. It was owned by Great Britain. George grew up in a big family. He had 6 brothers and 3 sisters. His family owned many farms in Virginia. They had enslaved people to do the work on the farms. George grew up on Ferry Farm. George. When George was 11, his father died. George had to help his mother and siblings run the family's farms. He also learned subjects at home until age 15. He learned math and writing. He read about good manners and being truthful. George liked to explore. At age 16, he took a trip with men who measured and mapped land. The map showed what the land looked like. George learned a lot. The next year, he got his first job doing the same thing. George joined the Virginia Army at age 20. He led his soldiers during the French and Indian War, 1754 to 1763. This war was fought between British and French colonies. George and the Virginian Army fought for the British. Both the British and the French had American Indians fighting for them. George learned a lot during the French and Indian War. He became a better leader. He learned how to make good plans for battles and wars. Family and hobbies. George married Martha Custis in 1759 at age 26. Martha had 2 children from her first marriage. George acted as a father to them. George and Martha's wedding. The Washingtons lived at Mount Vernon. It was one of the Washington family farms. But Martha often worked by George's side. When he went to war, she stayed in the army camps. She raised money for the soldiers. She also helped them as a nurse. Mount Vernon. George enjoyed many hobbies. He liked fishing and hunting. He also liked to swim and wrestle. George was a good dancer and horse rider. George liked farming. Different crops were planted on his farms. They grew corn, wheat, potatoes, and turnips. A lot of this work was done by enslaved people. George also made the house at Mount Vernon bigger. Leading a new country. After the French and Indian War, George began working with the leaders of the colonies. They felt that Great Britain was ruling them unfairly. They wanted to be free to make their own country. The Revolutionary War started in 1775. The colonies fought for freedom from Great Britain. They picked George to lead their army. The next year, on Christmas Day, George led his men across the Delaware River. They took the enemy by surprise. It was George's first big win of the war. George and his army crossed the Delaware River. In 1783, the colonies won the war. Afterward, George wanted to return to his farm, but the new country needed help forming a government. In 1787, leaders from the colonies met to talk about a new government. George led the meeting. The meeting's members wrote the U.S. Constitution. It showed how the U.S. government would work. The new country also needed a president. George won all of the votes. He became the first U.S. president on April 30th, 1789. George led the meeting to write the U.S. Constitution. George worked hard as president. He helped Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, and other leaders set up a new government. Many people did not agree on how the new country should be run. George is president in 1793. In 1792, George was elected president again. Many people even wanted him to be president a third time, but George wanted to go home. In 1796, he wrote a letter to say goodbye. In it, he said that Americans should work together as one country. Back to Mount Vernon. George and Martha moved back to Mount Vernon. George worked on his land and house, but he still wanted to help his country. In 1798, George was made the leader of the U.S. Army. George died on December 14, 1799. He was 67 years old. He was buried at Mount Vernon. People were sad that their first president had died. People in many cities came together to honor him. Some people in other countries did too. George at Mount Vernon. Remembering Washington. People remember George Washington in many ways. He is on the quarter and $1 bill. George's face is on Mount Rushmore in South Dakota. Americans also remember George's birthday on the third Monday of February. This holiday is called President's Day. Many places are named after George, too. Washington, D.C. is the U.S. capital. The state of Washington is also named after him. Mount Rushmore. George. Many people remember George with stories. One story says he chopped down a cherry tree as a boy. Then he told his father about what he had done. The story is made up, but it shows how important the truth was to George. George Washington was a great leader. He believed in working together. He helped when the United States needed him. He will always be known as the father of his country.